Welcome back to Transcriber from Reddit. Today's topic comes from the subreddit WomenInNews, posted by user MS Molly. The post is a linked post titled, When, quote, man, end quote, didn't mean humanity. How language excluded women for centuries. This has the dark pink tag labeled Women's Rights. Going to the article at theconversation.com. I read the title, When, quote, man, end quote, didn't mean humanity. How language excluded women for centuries. Published July 2nd, 2026. Written by Jacqueline Murray. I begin reading. Earlier this year, the Director General of Assessments of Canada's Integrated Threat Assessment Centre testified before the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. He explained that the anti-feminist movement is becoming increasingly relevant to national security. He argued that in certain contexts, quote, anti-feminist ideology can function as an enabling factor along pathways to violent extremism, end quote. Similarly, the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women reports that misogynistic views are becoming embedded in key institutions, including governments and political bodies, and are now shaping debates over education policy. These ideas are quote, aimed at dismantling or blocking progressive change for women's equality and human rights, end quote, according to the organization. As a historian working in Canada whose research covers sexuality and gender in medieval Europe, with a specific focus on masculinity and male sexuality, I can say that none of this is new in Western society. The power of sexist language, in fact, rests on a question medieval scholars debated centuries ago. Did the terms, quote, man, end quote, and, quote, mankind, end quote, include women or men alone? Section: Gendered Creation Story. Linguistic debates about the creation of humans emerge from the two very different versions of creation contained in the book of Genesis. In the King James Version of the Bible, Genesis 1 verse 27 states, quote, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Him. Male and female created he them, end quote. Here, the gendered words and the use of the plural are clearly inclusive. The word, quote, man, end quote, includes, quote, male and female, end quote. Furthermore, the plural, quote, them, end quote, indicates that men and women were created simultaneously and both are identical in God's image. Genesis 2, verses 21 to 23, which may be more familiar, tells a different story. It focuses on creation as a series of discrete sequential processes. God created Adam from the dust of the earth. Afterwards, recognizing Adam needed a companion, God created a woman, parentheses, Eve, and parentheses, from man's rib. Thus, man and woman were created separately, not simultaneously, nor from the same substance. Woman could also be understood as a secondary, and perhaps not in God's true image, but rather, in Platonic terms, a copy of a copy. For more information, linked here. These two creation stories form the foundation of Western culture's understanding of sex and gender, defining the biological natures and social roles appropriate to men and women. Within a patriarchal church and society, it appeared, quote, normal, end quote, that women, the copy once removed, should be subordinate. Consequently, Genesis 2 was used to explain women's inferior place in society, the family, and the moral order. This narrow definition of, quote, man, end quote, endured for centuries, from medieval theologians through scientific empiricists to the secular rationalists of the Enlightenment. Stripped of its biblical origins, quote, man, end quote, became an unexamined automatic term that referred to men alone. Section: Exclusion written into law. This was also the meaning of, quote, man, end quote, in the great documents that laid the foundations of Western liberal democracy. In France's 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, quote, man, end quote, meant men, not all human beings. The text, written in French, uses the word, quote, homme, end quote, which in French pertains to male persons as homo does in Latin. The United States Declaration of Independence of 1776 is similarly unambiguous. stating, quote, all men are created equal, end quote. There was no written or assumed equality for women either here, in the Constitution of 1787, or the subsequent 1791 Bill of Rights. The absence of women from these documents espousing equality was called out immediately by women themselves. They included Mary Wollstonecraft, a feminist philosopher in England, who published in 1792 a vindication of the rights of woman as a direct and deliberate response to the French Revolution. In the U.S., Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, one of the signatories to the Declaration of Independence, famously wrote to her husband, quote, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors, end quote. This was to no avail. John replied, quote, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems, end quote. Side note, you can see an image of the original the original versions of those letters below. Continuing on, it took more than a century for women's voices to be heard and women's legal rights and equality to be explicitly recognized. Unlike the French or American founding documents, the British North America Act of 1867 did not use the term, quote, man, end quote. Rather, it used the singular pronoun, quote, he, end quote, for an individual, but the gender-neutral plural term, quote, persons, end quote, for more than one individual. While, quote, he, end quote, retained elements of the exclusionary, quote, man, end quote, a, quote, person, end quote, was defined as someone over 30 years of age who owned $4,000 of property. Thus, quote, person, end quote, was ambiguous and did not necessarily refer to men alone. In Canada, the 1927 Persons case challenged the practice of excluding women from the Senate because they were not, quote, persons under the law, end quote. The final decision, made in Westminster, not Ottawa, was a rebuke of exclusionary misogynistic linguistics. Quote, to those who would ask why the word, quote, person, end quote, should include females, the obvious answer is, why should it not? Section, rights not guaranteed. While Canadian women were legal persons, that did not ensure they were fully equal. For example, they did not enjoy the same rights to marital property, and there were few safeguards against sex discrimination. From 1980 to 1981, they had to lobby to ensure that their equality was incontrovertibly enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This led to the inclusion of Section 28, which sets out clearly that men and women have equal rights. In this new world of the 2020s, what are women's rights and how safe are they when the vestiges of structural and linguistic inequality that can be traced back to ancient and erroneous interpretations of the Genesis creation stories remain embedded into individuals, institutions, and subcultures? Exclusionary language doesn't stay confined to old texts, because language is more than semantics. It constructs reality. The same logic that once asked whether, quote, man, end quote, included women, and decided by default that it didn't, resurfaces whenever a movement like anti-feminism frames women's rights as a deviation from a, quote, natural, end quote, order, rather than a baseline of equality. Here ends the article. Now, moving on from the article, and to the Substack, specifically featuring Abigail Adams' letter written to her husband, titled, Remember the Ladies and Be More Generous and Favorable to Them Than Your Ancestors. Excuse me, not Substack. It is actually her half of history.com. That has titled, from a section of Abigail Adams' letter, Remember the Ladies, says Abigail Adams. Originally posted March 30th, 2026. Before I get into the article, I read, it's Women's History Month, and this is the last of 5 bonus episodes giving free to all. If you've been enjoying them, please check out my Patreon page for details on how to get these regularly, not just in March. This particular bonus is a special one. As of March 31st, 2026, it has been exactly 250 years since Abigail Adams wrote her most famous line to her husband, John Adams. I begin reading. There's no denying that the wives of the American Founding Fathers were incredible, and at the top of the list is Abigail Adams. She was intelligent, educated, and admirable in so many ways. Also, we just plain know more about her than most of the wives because she and John wrote letters to each other when they were separated, and that was frequent. In March of 1776, John Adams was in Philadelphia at the Second Continental Congress. He was agitating for, could we finally get around to actually declaring our independence, please? He was also writing a very influential letter called, quote, Thoughts on Government Applicable to the Present State of the American Colonies, end quote, in which he said, quote, Politics is the science of social happiness, and the blessings of society depend entirely on the constitutions of government. ... The happiness of society is the end of government, end quote. His thoughts included some ideas that will be very familiar to those who have read the U.S. Constitution, like 3 branches of government, executive, judicial, and legislative, all with checks and balances on each other. A couple months later, John Adams was director of a committee of 5 to draft a Declaration of Independence, and lots of people thought he should write it himself. He persuaded his friend Thomas Jefferson to do it instead, but there's no denying that both the Declaration and the future Constitution have a lot of John Adams' ideas. But the one and only reason that John was free to do any of this was that he had a totally awesome wife back home in Massachusetts. Abigail Adams ran the household and the farm and the business affairs as a functionally single mother because John was away. Section: Abigail's Letter. In March of 1776, it was also Abigail, not John, who was living on the front line. Boston and the surrounding area had been the focus of war for almost a year. The British held the city, and George Washington was laying siege. Abigail had fled her city house for the family farm, and even though the British had now retreated, there was too much smallpox about for her to go check on the city house. In her letter, written March 31st, 1776, she tells John that she asked Mr. Crane to check on the Boston house, and he had reported the house was still standing. There was just nothing left inside it. Many of their neighbors were not so lucky. She is relieved that the British have retreating because she had been debating all winter whether it was even worth putting in a spring crop. Wouldn't they just be driven out of the farm as well? But now that the Brits have left, she feels sure she can plant. She says, quote, I think the sun looks brighter, the birds sing more melodiously, and nature puts on a more cheerful countenance, end quote. She had thoughts on what John was doing too. She wrote, quote, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection, and in imitation of the Supreme Being, make use of that power only for our happiness. End quote. Abigail then put down her pen and picked it up a few days later. She was in decidedly less jaunty mood then. She'd spent the intervening days tending the neighbors' sick children, and 2 of them were dead. Canker fever and mumps were raging through town. But despite this, she is planning to make soap for the year, and afterwards she will make saltpeter. The soap is for her and the family. The saltpeter was for George Washington's army. It's a key ingredient in gunpowder. As you can see, she had a lot on her mind. Section: John's Response. Fair warning, John Adams was admirable in many, many ways, and he had a lot in his mind too, but being admirable does not mean being perfect. He totally bombed his response to her letter in multiple ways. From a modern viewpoint, he'd have done better to not respond at all. But on April 14th, I'm sorry to say that he did respond. He has much to say about the fleet, the house in Boston, and how glad he is that Abigail is happy. Then he says, quote, As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe more numerous and powerful than all the rest were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy I won't blot it out. End quote. In other words, quote, aren't you cute when you try to be political? End quote. The idea of giving women improved rights is so startling to him that he thinks she must be joking. He also makes it clear that he considers children, women, Native Americans, and African Americans to be equally subject to people like him. This despite the fact that he was a rarity among the Founding Fathers and that he never enslaved anyone and considered the practice, quote, abhorrent, end quote. Parentheses, from John Adams to Robert J. Evans, end parentheses, linked here. He goes on to expound an excuse that was common and honestly is still common. It's the excuse that men are only nominally in charge. Really, they're at the mercy of the womenfolk who manipulate them regularly. He says, quote, depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up on this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. I am sure every good politician would plot as long as he would against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, or ochlocracy, end quote. Right so, John has just dug himself into a deep, deep hole. I could go on at length about it, but I'll restrain myself and say that what he has here is a very human failure to see anything but his own perspective. He has clearly never considered that Abigail would have made a fabulous politician had she been allowed, which she wasn't. And even more importantly, he's never considered the plight of the many, many women who were not as fortunate as Abigail. They were not married to a flawed, but mostly kindly, relatively well-off man like himself. Section: Abigail's response. By May 7th, Abigail had seen his letter, and her response is far, far more restrained than I would have been. She says, quote, I cannot say that I think you very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary power is like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken, end quote. If she had stopped here, I would cheer, but she goes on to accept the very excuse that John proffered, the idea that women do have a certain power over men. Quote, notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. ... On to the next quote. Charmed by accepting, by submitting sway. On to the next quote. Yet have our humor most when we obey. End quote. I don't really know how to interpret this last bit. Was Abigail saving face? Did she really believe in the soft power? Did she really believe that being desirable to men gave her enough power to offset a total lack of legal rights? Did she really think that was semi-acceptable? She may have believed it. After all, she was married to a mostly kindly, relatively well-off man. I'm not negating his flaws here. I'm just pointing out that he could have been an abusive drunk who gambled away the household money. Abigail's life would have been very different in that case. It was very different for a great many women. Abigail was clearly aware that not all women had it as good as she did. More aware than John was, that's for sure. But maybe she was not aware enough to fight harder. Or maybe she simply believed that nothing she could say would make a difference. And to be honest, she was probably right about that. The idea that women like Abigail should have a voice and representation in lawmaking would have to wait a long, long time. The 19th Amendment, parentheses, which would have given her the vote, end parentheses, was ratified in 1920. That's 144 years after Abigail asked her husband to remember the ladies. Here ends the article. Below that we see selected sources, linked below. And again, everything will be linked in the notes below this video. Side note, I like to think that women like Abigail knew what they were fighting for, then struggled to fight for it. And despite the prejudices of the men of their time, they managed to keep these ideas forward and going on to the next generation. Because despite the hubris and the tyranny of men, women did achieve the right to vote, thanks to the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. We still have a long way to go to be considered equal in the same way that men are in the law. And there are people that are trying to roll back those efforts, those rights that women have fought and bled and died for. And their allies as well. Don't forget that as we press on and make sure that everyone has the same rights and opportunities as those with power. Thank you for watching/listening, and I will see you in the next video.